Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It is good to see you all here. Thank you for coming to yet another installment of Saved. I feel like that should be my grandfather was a Southern Baptist deacon, and he would greet every person with, "How's your walk with the Lord?" Because if it wasn't good, he was ready. He was ready to help. Like, he was gonna get you right and say, we're not gonna do that today, but we're really delighted to yet again have Mark McEnroy walking with us through the very wonderful and multiplicities of understandings of salvation in scripture and in our tradition. And today I think we turn to deification, is that right? Let's start with prayer, and then I will take no more of the airtime so that Mark can have all of it. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. O God, who wonderfully created and yet even more wonderfully saved this creation, we thank you for the gift of your Son Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, and for the ways in which it transforms every living thing, and indeed the whole created order, the cosmos, things seen and unseen, and for the ways in which it transforms us. We thank you for this salvation which we have known in our lives, and we thank you for the salvation we know in Christian community together here. Be with us as we learn and help us to grow ever more in the knowledge and love of you. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. Yes.
Can you turn off the screen? We don't need to see the screen until afterwards.
Yeah, I can do that for sure. So I'm gonna,
Disturbing to see that thing flashing throughout his
sure.
people product.
As soon as I get the notes up, I will do that. Take it away,
As
Mark.
those things are happening.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you all for being here once again for this time around, our treatment of salvation as deification in week 5 of our salvation series. We can regard the movement of which we speak today as a movement from separation from God at the outset to incorporation into the very life of the Trinity. That's where this model of salvation takes us. And to put it that way, it might signal that as we have progressed during the course of our series from thin to thick in our understandings of salvation, getting thicker with every iteration as we move through the series, we are, I think you will agree, as we work through today's material, in the very thickest of the models at which we have looked. So this is an audacious understanding of salvation, to say that being saved involves being incorporated into the very divine life, to be, as it's put within the tradition, with stunning boldness, to be made divine, to be made God. This is a proclamation that one finds throughout the early church, and so we'll spend some time unpacking what it is that these figures are describing today. We spoke last time about the union that God effects among human beings. So to speak of salvation as true humanity, as we mentioned, was to think of salvation as co-humanity. We are with one another. This time, we can think of that union as playing out not only on the horizontal axis, if you will, among fellow human beings, but also along the vertical axis, right? We are joined with God, made one with God. And yet, as we'll talk about toward the end of our time today, to say that we are united on that vertical axis does not mean that we flee the world, right? There might be a temptation to think of deification as a flight into the divine that doesn't have much to do with one's neighbor. What we'll see, however, toward the end of our time is that deification for figures in the early church, for Anglicans, and down to the present day, has very much a this worldly application or playing out. So you can see, as always, we've got our handout before us, and we have a sense of where we're headed. I will say quickly one housekeeping thing before we refer to that plan for the day. And that is that, as you all are aware, I am sure, as I am aware, definitely, there has been a lot of desire to pose questions and make comments as we move through this material. And so in response to this, what we've done is added on a final session, a 7th session, that will be simply an open-ended dialogue. So this will be an opportunity for anyone to come and gather at the Sunday Forum, and I won't have anything on the agenda. We will simply look to all of you, to responses that you've had, questions that might endure despite our best efforts here, and any kind of things that we might want to talk about. So a seventh session on Pentecost. We'll see where the Spirit moves us on Pentecost and what we need to talk about still concerning salvation, just so that you all are aware. All right, so you can see on the handout where we're headed. The first thing I'd like to do is talk about the idea that deification is a multifaceted doctrine, by which I mean one finds diverse expressions for this understanding in scripture, and then I guess carried on into the tradition. There are a whole lot of things that being deified means, and so we'll gesture toward that. Then one of the most urgent items to address is this claim, we become God, really. We need to do some key clarifications about what that means, and we need to make some qualifications about what that does not mean. So that despite the arresting terminology of deification, there's some distinct limits that get placed on that in the early church that we do well to abide, lest we broach that creator-creature distinction and find ourselves in objectionable territory. Right? We'll do that. And then I'd like to talk about deification at the heart of Anglicanism. Some of the work that I've done has uncovered ways in which one finds this idea very, very well represented, especially among early Anglicans, but being carried on into the 18th and 19th and 20th and 21st centuries as well. So there's it's not distinctively Anglican by any means, but one finds a robust representation of the doctrine. This is a moment for some Anglican pride to come welling up, I think, and we can all, I hope, enjoy that. And then, as maybe gestured to moments ago, I'd like to talk about how deification is not, as it might be perceived, a mystical flight from the world, and how becoming like God involves becoming merciful as God is merciful. It involves that horizontal playing out of what being divine means. And here we do well to keep in mind, and we'll put some more on this in a moment, that one could think of deification, you could say generically, as there are various divine attributes that we might associate with any old God, any kind of God. And then there's deification as it pertains specifically to the God of Christianity. What does it mean to become like that God? And if we can keep that in mind, then we shift our understandings of deification in some important ways. All right, so as we turn to these diverse expressions that one finds within Scripture, I'd like to go through a few of the most frequently cited verses. There's more than we can include here than we have time to go through, but we'll kind of hit the high points and hope for the best when it comes to these scriptural foundations. The first thing to mention is that the most frequently cited verse that one finds today, or slightly different in the early church, but today one finds 2 Peter 1:4 as a frequently invoked backing or grounding for this. And there we find the idea that we may become partakers of the divine nature, or as it's otherwise put, we might participate in the divine. So we take part in God, according to this understanding that we find in 2 Peter 1:4. That language of participation is carried forward through the tradition. Additionally significant is Psalm 82:6. There we find, you are God's, children of the Most High, all of you. And then in John 10:34, Jesus repeats a portion of this psalm, so it gets support, you could say, from Christ. And here, of course, the language of being God's might be the most arresting, the most startling. But actually in the early church, it was the notion of being children of the Most High that received a great deal of attention. What gets carried forward in the New Testament are various expressions of what's called divine filiation, that is to say, being a child of God. And this happens in various ways. It happens through adoption in the Pauline materials. It happens through a suite of ideas in the Johannine materials, being born from God, being born from above, being reborn. So this notion of birth, it pervades the Johannine materials. But in both cases, the Christian is styled as a child of God, either by adoption or this birth from above. And we'll talk about how that plays out in a moment. But let's see some of what we mean here. So Romans 8:15-17, Paul gives classic expression to this idea. He says, you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. In fact, we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. That comes later in that verse. So being a child of God, being adopted into the divine family, We've got the Father and the Son. We are adopted such that we also are children of God, as Christ is God's Son. That, as mentioned before, is found in the various Johannine descriptions. From the prologue to the Gospel of John, for example, we find, to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh, but of God. And then again in 1 John 4, beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. If we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is perfected in us. So we move there from notions of children of God to God living within us. The divine indwelling is another major feature of deification. God lies within. God's very self comes within us, and we go into God. In John 17, we find a vivid expression of this. So it says, as you, Father, are in me, this is Jesus speaking, and I am in you, may they, that is human beings, also be in us. So we get drawn into those relations between the Father and the Son. We are right there with the Father and the Son in the intimacy of that relationship. There are other ideas that one finds within the New Testament, in particular, the notion of being in Christ gets expressed by Paul at many junctures. And then also being transformed into the likeness of God is another feature that gets drawn for the tradition. So in summary, we've got a lot going on. Again, these diverse expressions. There's the notion of partaking or participation. There's the notion of divine filiation, being a child of God through various means. There's God living within us and being united with God, joined with God. And to go through those quickly, I would suggest, strikes us with just how full and rich these descriptions are. Right? This is much more than a simple pardon from God. We have a robust understanding. It's much more even than being healed, as we spoke of a couple of Sundays ago, more than being united to other human beings. We are in God, and God is in us. This is a robust notion of salvation, a thick notion of salvation that we get expressed in Scripture. As we turn to the tradition, what we will find is these various biblical themes getting picked up. And we'll also find, as bold as this language is, figures in the early church are bolder still in their descriptions of how salvation operates along these lines. So there are two figures, Irenaeus and Athanasius, who give expression to an idea that's known as the exchange formula. And you see it's there on the handout. So Irenaeus gets the ball rolling on this, and Athanasius, his expression is probably the more famous of the two. But with Irenaeus, we find God, the Word, became what we are, in order that we may become what he himself is. And along similar lines, but more succinctly, Athanasius' classic expression, he became human that we might become divine. Or be made God, another expression. Theos is the Greek word. So there's a symmetry here. Deification and incarnation could be said to be two sides of the same coin. God became human, incarnation. Human beings become divine, deification. This is a classic expression of the idea. Additionally, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, who's operating in the 6th century, gives one of the more well-known definitions of deification. It is the attaining of likeness to God and union with him so far as is possible. So becoming like God, uniting with God, to the extent that that's a possibility for human beings. We get a vivid description by Cyril of Alexandria, and then we'll start getting some clarity, we hope, on what this means, and put some checks on just how far it should go. With Cyril, we get this image of wax. It's a powerful image, I think. He says, just as if someone were to entwine two pieces of wax together and melt them with a fire so that both are made one. So too, through participation in the body of Christ and in his precious blood, he is united in us, and we too in him. That's how thoroughgoing that union. one with God. gives further expression, you could say, to that notion of indwelling that we found in the Johannine materials with John 17 in particular. We are in God with the Father and the Son get incorporated into that divine life. So we've got some bold formulations here. What does it mean? It might leave us still with some questions. What does it mean exactly to become divine? And should we be drawing any limits here? Should we make sure we don't get too carried away, as bold as the language is, right? Do we need to do some sober-minded reflection, need to intervene here to make sure that we don't start flirting with heresy on a regular basis? Right? So Augustine, as he is so often helpful in various things, is helpful with getting us clarity, I think, on the one hand, or at least some clarity, and then definitely with drawing a key distinction. So concerning that clarity, as we turn to the material that's next on the handout, he says there, we could not be partakers of his Godhead unless he had been partaker of our mortality. He that is immortal became mortal, that through his death he might make us immortal. So this is similar to the exchange formula that we just saw, Irenaeus and Athanasius, right? There's that symmetry. But what we get here is immortality explicitly mentioned. So the exchange concerns Christ taking on mortality and death in order that we might be made immortal. So this is one way of putting a central idea that one finds in deification, namely that we become divine in the sense that we receive certain divine attributes. Immortality is the most frequently cited among those divine attributes. This gives us some clarity, I think, on what it means. There's yet more to be done, as we will do, but maybe we're casting about wondering what this consists of, then immortality is a major feature of the doctrine. Now, as we turn to the next quotation from Augustine, we'll start to see a key distinction which keeps us out of heretical terrain as he gives expression to the idea. He says, he has called men gods, for deified of his grace, not born of his substance or essence, would be another way to put it. Then there's that material from John 1:12, where he has given them power to become sons of God. If we have been made sons of God, we have also been made gods. But this is the effect of grace adopting, not of nature generating. So here's why that language from Paul with adoption is so valuable. We are children of God, right? As Christ is the Son of God. However, whereas Christ is born of God's substance, we are adopted into the divine family. So another way to put it is to say that what Christ is by nature, we receive by grace. So we then are not divine, not God in our very nature. We don't generate our divinity from within ourselves. If we did, we'd be crossing that divine between the creation and the creator, creature distinction. Instead, we are creatures who are brought into the Godhead through divine grace. So that creator-creature distinction is retained. The doctrine, you could say, walks right up to the very edge of orthodox thinking. It's exceptionally audacious, but ultimately it abides by that distinction between the creator and the creation. So it's an attention-grabbing way to put the Christian life. And then upon further elaboration, further reflection, we get things such that startling terminology is contextualized, made clear, we hope in some ways, and then we signal that we are within the confines of Orthodox Christianity. Now, as we turn to the Anglican material, I'd like to just gesture quickly toward one phenomenon that happens with deification, and there's a whole lot of detail that we don't really have time to get into at the moment, but the doctrine comes to be perceived in the modern period as a distinctively Eastern Christian idea. Eastern Orthodoxy, it is said, espouses this idea throughout the centuries, and the West, it is also said, is bereft of this idea until some immigrant Orthodox come to Paris in the early 20th century, and we start kind of delighting in the riches of the East. There's an enormous backstory for how we get to that point. What I would suggest for the moment is breaks down fairly quickly upon some investigation. And one moment where it breaks down concerns Anglicanism. Anglicanism, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, right, as Anglicanism, Church of England has begun. It is actually, I would argue, where one finds deification best represented across all the possibilities within Christianity, at least at this point in time. So that's to say, Orthodoxy is not especially interested in the doctrine just yet. If you're looking around, some pietists are getting, carried away actually with some questions. They're not necessarily abiding by that creator-creature distinction so studiously as Augustine and others do. But Anglicanism is a real place where deification is finding all kinds of expressions. So just to give you some sense of this, there's a great deal of detail that we could get into here. Figures such as John Jewell, Richard Hooker, Lancelot Andrewes, the Cambridge Platonists are a group of figures. Benjamin Whichcote, we'll hear from in a moment. He's kind of the father of the Cambridge Platonists, but John Smith, Ralph Cudworth, and Henry Moore also give expression to the idea, along with Jeremy Taylor. So there's a whole host of Anglicans who are saying things along the lines that we will see. We'll get a quick sampling here. So we find with Richard Hooker, a bold expression along similar lines to what we've encountered previously. God hath deified our nature, Hooker says in his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Then he goes on, by virtue of this grace, man is really made God. So again, that bold language, one finds Hooker letting it fly, right? Lancelot Andrewes, figure some of you might be familiar with. He integrates 2 Peter 1:4, the idea of being made partakers of the divine nature, with elements of the exchange formula. And he has what we have on the handout there. He taking our flesh, and we receiving his spirit, which he imparteth to us, that as he by ours became a consort of human nature, so we by his might become partakers of the divine nature. Again, 2 Peter 1:4 at the end, and there's that symmetry, that inverse relationship that we encountered with the exchange formula. God taking on human nature, we participating in the divine nature. Benjamin Whichcote, a figure who is a really extraordinary figure, actually. There's a whole backstory to him that we don't have time to get into either. But he's tapping into this deification tradition as a counterpoint to certain ways in which he was formed during his theological education. He feels there's an enrichment of the Christian tradition that needs to occur. And so he says this, he says, real holiness is our participation in God and our resemblance of him. This makes us really deiform. So again, that term, deiformity, cropping up with him. So there's lots more where this came from. We'll also see Whichcote and then Jeremy Taylor are going to be key for getting clear on some possible misunderstandings of the idea that one finds in the contemporary setting, which we'll dwell on in some of that mystical flight in particular. They help us to correct that misunderstanding. So you've got this idea that's playing out in the early church, it's playing out within Anglicanism, it's playing out in a lot of other settings, and it gets a lot of attention. It gets a lot of enthusiasm at various moments in Christian history. It's seen as a supplement, a counterbalance to the perception of salvation as simply receiving forgiveness from God. We began our series there. There's some profound things happening there, to be sure, but this is quite a bit thicker. I expect you'll agree. Some questions might endure about what it means still. And as we've touched on briefly, it's an idea that's easy to get wrong. Right? You're talking about becoming God. That could go wrong in all kinds of ways. And that issue gets compounded by some misinterpretations of deification in the modern period. So I gestured toward the misperception of the doctrine as Eastern. There are also misperceptions of it having to do, it is sometimes thought, as simply attaining immortality and being decidedly world fleeing. One thing that's in the background here are the individualistic views of salvation that have animated a lot of the lens through which modern scholars look at the early church. So a great deal of my scholarly work involves retrieval of various Christian ideas that get neglected for periods of time within the history of the church and then discovered once again. And there are fascinating things happening with retrieval because in the first place, it's prompted by the particulars of the contemporary situation. And so that is to say, there's something that's missing in the setting from which retrieval takes place that scholars and theologians seek to correct. Right? They're looking for something for a reason. The other thing that happens with retrieval is that look backward, if you will, is conditioned by the circumstances out of which the retrieval is launched. And in this case, the reason that's important is because we have, for a couple of centuries before the modern interest in deification begins, this individualistic notion of salvation has really kind of taken hold. So what that means for our purposes is that when scholars in the modern period look back at deification, they see receiving immortality. They see only, for at least a period of time, what the individual human being gets from God. And what they miss, and what I'll make a case for in a moment, is the fact that this extraordinary gift from God, God's very presence, is indeed given to the human being. But it doesn't stop there. That's not the end of deification, is not for the individual to receive the divine presence and be incorporated into the divine life. Instead, as we'll see in a moment here through Athanasius and others, the Christian receives God's very presence and comes to resemble God. But it's the Christian God whom the Christian is resembling. So yes, immortality is part of the picture, but there's a lot of attributes of God that might be more particular to Christianity. And maybe just to put it simply for a moment, deification is not about becoming supercharged with divine powers, right? It's not getting cranked up such that we are like God in the sense of being so much superior to human beings. Right? Instead, it gets inflected in a very particular set of ways that lead right into mercy toward the other and service, openness toward the neighbor. So let's look at some of that material because I think it counterbalances some misperceptions of deification and gives us a fuller understanding of the doctrine. So the first figure who's doing this is Athanasius. It's he, who is most frequently cited when it comes to deification. God became human so that we might be made God. And yet, listen to what he says about what that means, and he spells it out further in later writings. So he says this. He says, God is pleased to call us poor mortals by the title of gods. It does not make us, as God, the source of happiness to the creature. It is more in this way, that we are disposed to distribute benefits and to give assistance freely, impartially, and universally, even as God himself does. For it is only in this manner that we can, in any sense, become imitators of God, when we dispense to others and bestow liberally upon other people those good gifts which come to us from him. So to Athanasius, becoming deified, becoming like God, resembling God, it's not just about what one receives. And God's gifts don't have as their end point the individual Christian on whom they are directly bestowed. And instead, the deified Christian functions as, you could say, an instrument through which divine gifts flow. Those gifts are to be dispensed to others. So the vertical axis, you could say, is not without the horizontal as well. And union with God has everything to do with union with one's neighbor. Gregory of Nazianzus, a figure we have spoken of previously, he's one of those Cappadocian fathers, along with Gregory of Nyssa, from whom we heard previously in the course. He is, in his context, encountering ideas that attend this term theosis, or that's the Greek for deification. Right? And there are perceptions of that idea, not applied to Christianity, that are, as he puts it, marred by vainglory and self-love. So that is to say, becoming divine in the context in which he's operating is getting understood in all kinds of ways that he would object to. He wants to seize on the term, reappropriate it, you might say, and deploy it within a Christian understanding in order to inflect things along very similar lines to what we just heard from Athanasius. So from him, we have come to be a God to the unfortunate, by imitating God's mercy. Imitate God's philanthropy. It is in this, in doing good, that one is preeminently divine. You can become God without hardship. Do not forego the opportunity for deification.
So who are the unfortunate?
Who are the unfortunate? Those who are in positions of acute need in the context in which Gregory's operating. So he and Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nyssa they were extremely important for the development of Christian doctrine. They also were doing all kinds of things. We spoke of some of this previously in the course for the poor, for those who are disadvantaged in their societies. The surprising thing is that it gets expressed in the language of deification. That's not where one might immediately go. And importantly, I mean, Gregory knows full well the possibility for a view of theosis to be misunderstood as focused on the individual self. This idea is in the water, you could say, in the context in which it's operating. And he takes steps to counter that very perception of the doctrine. There are some Anglicans, as mentioned moments ago, who will say some things along similar lines. So Benjamin Whichcote says, "For this is truly divine and godlike, to do good, to compassionate, to relieve and gratify, and to pardon sin upon fitting terms." So that's what it is to be like God, to do good, to be compassionate toward one's neighbor. And then Jeremy Taylor, another figure in these with these thinkers, he says, "We are called to our approximation to God by the practice of this grace. We are made partakers of the divine nature," in 2 Peter 1:4 there, "by being merciful, as our Heavenly Father is merciful." So right in keeping, I would suggest, with those expressions in the early church, we find that horizontal outworking of the idea. Now, as we turn to the contemporary viability, we're going to see this idea get radicalized by Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury. Before that, though, let's talk about how deification fares today. The fairly succinct way to put it is to say that starting in the early 20th century, there is a perceived poverty or thinness of Western views of salvation. And we've gestured toward that previously in the course of a couple of moments. And this perceived poverty prompts many to turn to the Christian East, to turn to orthodoxy as supplementing or filling out the perception of what salvation is. And so the boldness of the vision is precisely its attractive feature. And so it is thought to revivify the life of faith. And one thing that you could say that makes clear is that union with God is not just the destiny of a handful of mystics. Right? Instead, it's humankind's common inheritance. We are heirs with Christ, as we heard with Paul. And that inheritance will involve being incorporated into the divine life. So all that is to say, there's tremendous enthusiasm for the doctrine as one gets into the early to mid 20th centuries. There are concerns about its arresting terminology, and those concerns are assuaged by figures such as Augustine. Some remain worried nonetheless, but there's a lot of energy and excitement about deification because it's perceived to give Christianity something it's been missing for far too long, a much, much richer notion of what it means to be saved, to be incorporated into the divine life, to be right there alongside the Son in relation with the Father and the Holy Spirit. Now, as much as there is enormous enthusiasm for the doctrine, I think it's fair to say that not everyone goes in the direction of mercy toward the other, as we've outlined Athanasius and those Anglicans doing. Rowan Williams does, and he goes very far with the idea. It really intensifies what this consists of. He expounds on that strand of the doctrine that focuses on the filial relation of the human being to God, that is to say, the human being as a child of God. And for Williams, that relationship is crucial for overcoming, as he thinks of it, a protective individualism that impedes relationship with God and relationship with one's neighbor. As you'll recall, those of you who were here last time, we were talking about that individualism impeding relationship with neighbor, right? The idea that We are a human being as an isolated individual, one marble in a big bag of marbles that is humankind as a whole. And we attempted to move out of that. What we encounter with Williams is a push to do that on the horizontal plane that is arrived at or achieved through the vertical relation, through what it means to be a child of God. So coming to understand oneself then as a child of God has the potential to reconfigure dramatically the very notion of what it means to become a person in relation to God. And Williams develops an account of deification that involves, as he thinks of it, a relinquishment of the false sense of the self as this substantive individual. So pivotal for Williams' account is this idea that our filial relation to God, our relation to God as a child of God, finds its foundation in the self-emptying existence of the Word in relation to the Father. And so the Word, Christ, stands in a very particular relation that's not consistently seen, Williams would suggest. So he gives expression to this. It's a dense quotation, but it's worth going through. He says, the eternal existence of God, the Word, is kenotic. That's a term some of you might be familiar with, kenosis. It comes from Philippians 2, the Christ hymn that one finds there, the idea that Jesus empties himself. Kenosis is the Greek thing. So the eternal existence of the Word is kenotic or self-emptying, in that it is wholly defined, not by any individual intrinsic property located in some autonomous divine subject, but by its derivation from and orientation to the Father. What it is to be the Word is to be that which is poured out from the eternal source. A lot happening here, and furrow our brows to get a handle on what it is, right? But basically what it's saying is that the Word, Christ, who Christ is he who is sent by the Father. He's not an autonomous individual divine subject. He is that which is poured out from God. And that self-emptying continues in Christ's ministry in the world. So if this is right, then I would suggest, Williams would as well, it impacts enormously what it means to be an adopted child of God. So if the Son stands in a filial relation with the Father, into which we are integrated by divine grace, then we become as the Son is. That was in play earlier. But to become as the Son is to enter into this relation with God that we just heard described. There's nothing that's possessed there, Williams said. There's no solid self that owns, accumulates, gives, or holds back. So to become by grace what the Word is by nature, the language we've encountered with Augustine, is to relinquish one's understanding of oneself as an isolated individual. And in so doing, to become instead a person from which divine life is poured out into the world. So the conception runs contrary to a lot of our ordinary thinking about the human being, about what it means to be a person. Williams says to become personal in this mode is antithetical to most of what we typically think of as personal, which has to do with, as he puts it, the fantasy of the substantive individual over against God and other subjects. So again, that marble, that self-enclosed entity, right? That's illusory, Williams suggests. So deification then is the process of becoming a person, not as a finite individual who relates to God and world as an individual, but instead as one whose illusory self is undone, so that God's life might pour through. So this reconfigured understanding gives us implications for hospitality to the neighbor coming into clear view. So if the process of becoming deified entails this intensified vulnerability, not some movement into a secure, isolated location, then it leads to the idea that, and this is the next quotation from Williams, we are constantly becoming in the life of deifying grace, ever more uniquely personal, precisely in our opening to the otherness of God and our neighbor. So the deified person then is one whose protective, self-isolating walls have been let down, one who is exposed to the need of the world, the one who carries out into the world the self-giving of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So we are very far here from deification as becoming supercharged with divine attributes. And it makes all the difference in the world, I would suggest, to think of ourselves as becoming like the God of Christianity, becoming a child of God in the same sense that the Son is the child of the Father. That filial relationship between our Father and Son involves the Son being poured out from the Father such that the Father's will can be done in the world. To become like Him means that we also are poured out from God, protecting ourselves in relation to God, opening ourselves up to the neighbor. So this, I think, is an important thing to make clear when it comes to deification. As much as there's excitement about the idea, and as much as it enriches the divine life, it takes a very particular form within a Christian understanding that, among other things, does a lot of work to make it align with features of Christianity with which we're more familiar, right? So if the language that we become God might make us want to tap the brakes on this idea, and we get some means of doing so through Augustine and others. What we've just outlined through Rowan Williams, especially, but through some other figures as well, gets us in very familiar territory, but thinking of it in perhaps a subtly different way. To be like God, to be like the God of Christianity, is to be merciful toward the other, is to allow the Father's will to work through us, such that we are a conduit for it in the world. All right, so let's spend a moment, if we can, on existential reality as we have talked about it. So we are shifting, ideally here, from the book learning that we have just embarked on into perhaps more of an experiential basis. With deification, this might be a little bit difficult. Maybe experiences of forgiveness weren't so tough to think of in previous iterations of the course. This time, we might be there, we might not be. We'll give this a try, and then we'll open things up for a conversation. So a couple of questions to pose and to contemplate. When have you felt the presence of God within you? When have you felt yourself to be drawn up beyond yourself, perhaps into God? And when have you known yourself to be doing the will of God? You felt yourself to be a channel through which God's love is working out in the world. All right, so we've got a few minutes to talk things over. We had a little bit of a crash course, initial orientation to a really surprising, bold idea, and then some, one hopes, clarifications on how to take that bold language, what it means and where it goes, and then getting into some re-understandings of the idea that we do well to get clear on, I think. What questions or thoughts do we have? Dan?
So, thank you. This has been very interesting. I was thinking though about the early Christians when they were talking about deification. They had an example of that. The Roman emperor would adopt the successor, and the job that the successor had is when the Roman emperor died was to deify them. The point of deification was the salvation. The Romans were very law and order. They had a strict rule of law and stuff, and the emperors would constantly be violating that because of the position that they are absolute ruler. So the deification was needed so that God can't sin, therefore if they were God, whatever they did was okay. Now, 2,000 years later, the concept still is very present because the Supreme Court is debating whether or not the president has immunity for his actions. So, nothing's changed in 2,000 years. like, you know, we don't call it sin, we call it immunity, but, you know, punishment, but it's still a good concept, so thank you.
To that point, that instance that you cite in the Roman Empire is indication that the term is getting used in a lot of different ways in the context in which early Christianity is taking root. And that fact prompts some to think that deification is not inherent to the Christian tradition, but it's instead something that they kind of take on that's in the broader culture of which they're a part. There's a lot behind that kind of reading. What scholars who will defend the idea will hasten to emphasize are the biblical materials that are foundational for the doctrine, but more importantly, the way in which, as we've tried to explain here, what you're describing is definitely not what Christians are invoking, right? That's not the ideal, the reality into which they themselves are moving. And in fact, Richard Nazianzus seems to be aware of the kind of abuses of theosis, of deification that are afoot. So that conception that you've outlined, Dan, would be, as he thinks of it, marred by vainglory. And that's precisely what we're working against in the Christian understanding.
But it is the salvation or the forgiveness of sins.
It's right, one operates as God, and that comes with a whole host of privileges, with the understanding of the Roman Empire that you're describing. It's quite different within Christianity. Your Grace.
Over the years, whenever I would do baptismal counseling, especially for young couples with a new baby, one of the questions when they would come in that I would ask was, now, are you aware that you're giving your child up for adoption? And when you think about raising a child in the faith, that the self-giving, the deification that we are given in baptism and the raising up of a child is in itself a way of bringing God into the world if we do that with faith and with the letting go that childbearing involves. Thank you for that. This has been really good.
That's beautiful. I mean, the phrase "it takes a village" comes to mind as you're giving up the child for adoption. The child is being adopted into the divine family, and it's that family that will help along with the mother and father in raising the child.
Because we all say we will
Yeah.
support this child.
Right.
And same with weddings. I used to say to married couples, I'd say, you've invited everybody here to meddle. In a sense to say, to hold you accountable for the vows that you're making here. So that whenever we do something liturgically in front of the community to make a commitment like that, we're articulating something of what it means to self-empty and to take on.
Right. And the import of that in the early church, I think it's just really hard for us to understand, right? What it means to come into that family, to be adopted into that family. I mean, that was not something that was just said out loud, right? I mean, people were coming into the church, forming bonds with fellow Christians in ways that were directly analogous to, if not even more robust than bonds with their own families of origin, right? So it's an extraordinarily powerful way of thinking. John?
So Mark, one of the stories of the New Testament that I'm always drawn to and thinking about is the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, who at the end of the story realize that this stranger they've been interacting with for hours is Jesus. Is there any commentary like the ones we've been talking about this morning that puts the idea of deification into that story or gives it that meaning?
There certainly there's a connection between the kind of perceiving that happens among the disciples, right? So they don't see Jesus for who he is, and then they do, and something happens in that shift. Their perception changes. And there will be many who will talk about deification as what enables perceiving things correctly it's you could say the precondition for that proper perception. So that is to say, as as one is drawn into the divine life, one is able to see things as they actually are.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, and this is probably my own, idiosyncratic reading, that what the disciples are seeing is that we all partake of the divine, and that therefore this person is by virtue of being human, is Christ-like.
Mhm.
Is there anyone, or am I on my own?
Well, no, I mean, so within Christology, an important point to uphold is the idea that Christ is fully human, but that humanity is permeated with the divine. It's so Christ's body is deified. It's the kind of the first site or locus, you might say, of deification is in the very body of Christ, which is then transfigured, manifests itself in the transfiguration. So that is to say, his humanity is full and yet it's shot through with divinity at the very same time. And that's the condition for our deification, which gives it a very material outworking. We'll talk about materiality next week when we get to eschatological fulfillment, the importance of the body, the importance of not flying off a la Platonism into the ether, never to return, but instead remaining in the material world. It's a major commitment within Christianity that has incarnation as one of its key pillars. Yeah.
I had an experience this morning with Darling. She came up to me and gave me a hug this morning, which was so sweet. And then she went over and got what's his name? Name tag, thanks guys. Name tag and started to write. She didn't know my name, but I had my own name tag, which I took out of my purse and went like this, like, you don't need to write me a name tag. I've got my name tag. But she took the pen and wrote my name by copying my name onto my name tag. And so I took a name tag. Well, she had started to write her name, started with a D. And then she put that down and then we did this copying thing. And then I took the pen and finished writing her name on her name tag and put it on her. And it was just such a beautiful blessing of each other this morning. So that seems to say this
Right.
in some kind of way.
No, I get it. There's a mutuality of.
It was just, yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Mhm.
I think, so Chris, I saw your hand.
Well, that's a hard story to find. I just wanna wallow in it, but thank you for that.
It's just truly beautiful.
I just am wondering, the idea of the incarnation, basically the incarnation as one way of thinking about Christ. But of course, in the Judaic texts, we learn from the outset that humanity is made in the image of God. We find many references to various virtuous characters as sons of God.
Yeah.
God as a father, though that one really goes viral within Christian discourse, is nevertheless embedded in Judaic conceptions. And then Jesus says, back to the one, for example, the road to Emmaus, when you do this for the least of these, you do this for me. And so I guess where I'm going with this is that what gets back to a conversation I had earlier this week, that what we're really up against is idolatry again, and that what we call kenosis is getting over that hump. But that I guess what I'm wondering is whether the incarnation per se is necessary to our understanding of God's immanence, since that's already a Judaic concept. And Jesus within that tradition uses some radical interventions, like if you do this for the least of these, you do this for me. I mean, he's taking on his identity as the Son of God, but that identity, that maybe the virgin birth and all that apparatus is an add-on to something that goes maybe even deeper. So I hope that was it.
Yeah,
portion that
right.
makes
No, I get that.
sense.
There are claims previously to, the immanence of God, the pervasiveness of God. I mean, one just quick way to talk about it might be to say that with the idea of incarnation, we get an intensification of that claim, right? And the idea that although God is indeed everywhere, God is with us in a very particular way, in human beings, and that the way it unfolds in Christ is the foundation for, the rest of us. There's a great deal more that could be said. I fear that we are, at our
Very
time. Let's pray quickly, and then, we can make our way. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Gracious God, in your grace, you have given us your very self to dwell within us, to transform us, to make us ever more into the likeness, resemblance of you. Help us, Lord, to enter into relation as your children, so that we might, as your Son has done, be vessels for your work in the world. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.